Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Kia ora everyone, and thank you for making the time to join this webinar on freshwater consultation. My name is Sophia and I'm the manager for the water policy team at the Ministry for Primary Industries. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to this session, and then my colleague at the Ministry for the Environment, Winiata, will explain some of the House rules and details on how to participate, including how to send through your questions in this session. So this webinar will cover the government's current proposals for freshwater farm planning regulations and amendments to the existing low slope map, which is used in stock exclusion regulations. The purpose of this webinar is to present what is being proposed in the discussion documents, which are already available online, to talk through what the proposals are, how they relate to existing freshwater requirements, and to answer questions that you may have. We really hope that this session will help clarify what is being proposed and help inform submission if you would like to make one. These sessions are really important for us to hear your feedback and your questions. This information will help inform the final design of the regulations. I should note this is the first in a series of webinars. Details for the upcoming ones are available on the Ministry for the Environment website. If you have questions that are about other areas of government policy, I'm sure you can appreciate we won't be in a position to answer all of them. And we really want to maximize the time that we have in this session to help inform getting these regulations right. Where we can't answer questions related to other areas, we should be able to let you know how to find out that information. Thank you again from me for making the time available to join this webinar. We know it is a really busy time for everyone. Winiata will now take you through how to participate in this session. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Sophia. Hey, kia ora and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Winiata Anderson. I'm a senior policy analyst here at the Ministry for the Environment. And today, I guess I'm our host with the most, aka facilitator, aka MC. And my job today is just to help to keep things running smoothly. So welcome, everybody. Hey, look, as Sophia has just pointed out, the purpose of this webinar is to outline freshwater farm plan regulation proposals and the proposed changes to the stock exclusion low slope map. Bit of housekeeping. We've got you for about an hour and a half, 90 minutes. It's a hell of a long time to stare at a screen. So please feel free to run away at any point. We'll try to break for a couple of minutes at half time, but we'll see how we go. The webinar will be recorded for those who can't make it. We endeavour to upload the recording in the next few days. The links will be shared after this hui. Hey, look, because we have such a huge group, a large group of attendees today, I'm looking at 124 of us in the room right now. Awesome. The thing is, we won't actually be opening the floor. So I know you can see the hand function there. How you'll be able to interact with us today is through that Q&A box. Should be at the bottom of your screen. That is because it's just too difficult to manage in an online setting like this. So if you need to interact with us, if you have any pārtai, any questions, thoughts, constructive criticisms, wonderful ideas, or lovely feedback for the team and I throughout the next hour, I do encourage you to please use that Q&A box. We've got a great team of experts on hand monitoring the box today. You can choose to be anonymous, so please fire away. We'll try to get through all the questions during the Q&A session in the second half. But if we do run out of time, rest assured, our team will circulate a complete Q&A sheet answering all relevant questions we received today during this meeting. So alternatively, if you don't want to use the questions box, you can send your questions directly to our email address. One of our team will be putting that email address directly in the chat for you to see now, please, and we'll come back to you directly. Ka pai. Again, on behalf of MFE and MPI, thank you very much for attending this webinar today. I'm going to hand it over to our Chief Advisor, Brian Smith, to introduce himself and take us through the presentation. I'll be sitting in the background, keeping track of time and jumping in whenever Brian starts talking too much. Again, my name's Winiata Anderson. Pleasure to meet you all today. Pleasure to be your host. Welcome. Kia ora, everybody. Brian.
Kia ora, Winnie. Thank you for that introduction. And I just add my words of welcome to everybody and thank you for giving your time today. I thought we'd start off with just a little brief discussion about essential freshwater, which is the wider package in which both the freshwater farm plans and the stock exclusion regulations sit. I'll also make a brief comment at the end about intensive winter grazing, because that has been an issue that people have raised some concerns about. So I'll just give you a quick update on where we're at with the intensive winter grazing issue as well. When we started this journey, which seems like a lifetime ago now, back in 2018, the government laid out 3 key objectives for its policy and its policy reforms related to freshwater. They were to stop further degradation, to show material improvement in our waterways within 5 years, and to reverse past damage within a generation, so that our waterways are in a healthy state. I think the last one's really important, and it's important to bear in mind that I think the government has always appreciated that a number of these issues have taken us, well, in some cases, centuries to get where we are, or a century or more to get where we are. And it will take some time, sometimes decades, in order to get back to the sort of state of waterways that we are looking for. The essential freshwater is made up of 6 key elements, which are on the screen here. I won't go into them into great depth, but I will just touch on how they fit together, because it's quite important. The first one is the new national policy statement for freshwater. That's really direction to councils to require them to set long-term visions for where water needs to be, and then to work towards achieving those visions in the long term. It also is the place where you may have heard of expressions of DIN, dissolved in organic nitrogen, bottom lines for sediment, bottom lines for mahinga kai, those sorts of things. They are contained in the National Policy Statement for Freshwater. Councils have until 2024, the end of 2024, to deliver new plans, regional plans that implement that national policy statement on freshwater. And that's really significant context for freshwater farm plans, because ultimately freshwater farm plans will need to reflect whatever rules, and including things like nutrient limits if councils decide to go there. They will ultimately need to reflect what those rules are. The next key bit is the National Environmental Standard for Freshwater and the Stock Exclusion Regulations. I'll deal with those 2 things together. These were regulations that pretty much take effect immediately, although some of the provisions are phased in over a number of years. And they're really to address those sort of first 2 objectives the government had, to stop further degradation and to start making material improvement. The next key component is there's a new planning process that councils must use when they're making their regional plans. And that includes new independent freshwater commissioners, and the commissioners will be chaired by an Environment Court judge or a retired Environment Court judge. The key difference here is compared to the current process, is when a plan is at the hearing stage, the commissioners will take over the hearings process. And if the commissioners make a recommendation and the council adopts that recommendation, then that's the end of the appeal process. You can still appeal on points of law, but on points of on de novo appeals won't proceed. And that's really important, because it both accelerates the process, but it also means people need to engage fully in the process during the plan making process and during that hearings process. The next key component is this idea of freshwater farm plans, which we're going to talk to you about today. I won't go into any more detail on that right now. And then finally, as part of Budget 19, the government introduced the productive and sustainable land use investment, and then subsequently jobs for nature and funding. Now, those things together put together about $700 million odd worth of money, primarily focused at achieving freshwater outcomes. So that's essential freshwater as an entire package. Let's talk about freshwater farm plans now. So why did the government decide to do it? Well, there are a number of key reasons, but probably the most important was there was a lot of feedback we received during the consultation on essential freshwater that one-size-fits-all rules don't really work that well. And, we've discovered that, to be frank, as we've worked through issues like stock exclusion and issues like intensive winter grazing. Freshwater farm plans directly respond to that kind of that concern about one-size-fits-all rules. The idea is that we can now create bespoke solutions that are specifically tailored to the situation of each farm and the risks and physical location, physical characteristics of each farm. The opportunity then is to avoid having to write too many specific rules, and or over time we can potentially replace the need for some resource consents. Now, that's not to say councils won't still need to put in place rules. There may be specific things that they need rules for, nor does it mean that there won't be any resource consents. I would expect that things like point source discharges from farms may still well be subject to resource consents, but it does mean that there is a new tool in the toolbox which is more suited to bespoke solutions that are tailored to individual farm requirements. Another advantage of them is they also bring all of the requirements, all of these new regulatory requirements that are in council plans into a single place so that farmers can relate all of those things to their farm. And we know that through undertaking action at farm and at scale, we can get really, really significant environmental gains. And I think that's the point here. Our Land and Water Science Challenge has identified in reductions in sediment are possible simply by implementing the known mitigations that we have available now, that reductions in sediment loads of up to 70% are possible by doing what we already know works without having to change mass land use or any of those sorts of things. And that's a huge gain that we can potentially achieve through the use of the freshwater farm planning system. And we also know it works in practice because we've seen it work. Horizons, for example, has a program of the Sustainable Land Use Initiative, and they've managed to reduce or improve the quality of water by 1 whole grade of sediment, which is a significant improvement. And they've done that in about 7 years. And they've done it because farmers have acted together and they've put in place measures that are known to address or reduce sediment on their farms, but they've done it in coordination with each other. So the gains and the potential gains here are really significant. There's been a lot of talk about integrated farm planning, and there's also been some concern raised with us that the freshwater farm planning regime seems to be out on its own, and what about everything else that farmers need to do? And we understand that. The freshwater farm planning part of the equation here will be, if you like, it'll be a module of an integrated farm planning approach, and the Ministry for the Environment is along that journey now of starting to put into place framing principles and a planning framework to help farmers bring all this together in one place. It's things like people management, biosecurity, animal welfare, greenhouse gas emissions, of course, and freshwater farm plans, which we're talking about now. Another key question is, how does this new regime, the new system of freshwater farm plans, fit with all of the outstanding work that many farmers are already doing out there and the numerous other farm planning systems that are already in place? And the answer is we need a system, we need to develop a system that builds on, does not replace what farmers have already been doing and what industry bodies and processes, for example, have already got in place. We know that the primary sector has been taking a leadership role in farm planning, and we want to build on and not replace that. Specifically, what we're looking at is a mechanism that will allow the existing programs to adapt so that they meet the requirements of Part 9A of the RMA. I'll cover that in a second. That's the bit of legislation that set freshwater farm plans up, so that they can adapt their programs so that they meet the legislative requirements, and then they can be formally recognised as being able to deliver a freshwater farm plan. That will give farmers confidence that if they carry on using the programs that they've got, albeit with adaptation, they can meet the requirements of the Act. If you're not part of one of those, you still need a pathway to be able to produce, or farmers will still need a pathway to be able to produce a freshwater farm plan. Exactly how that works, we're still sort of developing, but the expectation is it's likely to be a sort of independent assessment process where let's say it was NZ GAP, for example, just for example, it could be Te Aki or Lead with Pride or any number of the other industry programs that are out there. They want to have that recognised, that could go to an assessment group. It would be independently assessed and then formally recognised. Okay, another key point is how does all this fit with what councils are already doing in their plans and are going to do in their plans in order to implement the new national policy statement and your existing resource consents? And the answer to that is, in the legislation that set this up, there is a requirement that when a council develops a rule, let's say they put a rule in, it might be nitrogen limits, for example, it might be the maximum amount of nitrogen that a farmer in a particular area can discharge. If there is such a rule, that rule needs to be reflected into the farm plan. If there isn't such a rule, then the farm plan will look at what you'd normally expect in sort of good practice activity to manage nutrients the most effective way. But if there is a rule and the rule is stricter than those good management practices, then that strict rule has to be reflected in the farm plan. And councils are able to put in place stricter rules than, for example, we've currently got in national direction. So in stock exclusion, for example, the law under the regulations requires a minimum of 3 meters setback when you're required to do stock exclusion. There could be situations where councils are not confident that that will be sufficient, and they are able to, if they choose, put in a wider limit. If they put in a wider limit, that wider limit needs to be reflected in the farm plan. Okay. We are hopeful and we expect that over time, the freshwater farm plans, with their ability to create a bespoke solution based on in an individual farm, will be increasingly relied upon rather than having to write hard and fast rules. But that depends on us building confidence in the system and making sure the system is transparent and works well, and we can show that it works well. There's a transition we need to go through, right? At the moment, we've got a whole series of farm planning documents or farm planning systems, and most of those, or many of those, will have an environmental component to them. Until we're ready to introduce mandatory farm plans through this regulatory system, people should carry on using those, because most of the actions in there will be the kind of actions you'd expect to be put into your farm plan, your freshwater farm plan, in any event. So carry on with what you're doing at the moment. None of that effort will be wasted. Over the next 1 to 5 years, we expect we'll be rolling out the freshwater farm planning system around the country as each area becomes ready, if you like, to bring the system into place. Key thing will be councils are yet to write the regional rules or regional plans that implement the new national policy statement. So before that comes into effect, there'll be a first generation of plans based on what rules currently councils have and the best available information we have about what's going on in the catchment and what's important for the catchment. But it's important to recognise that once councils do implement their new regional plans that to implement the new national policy statement, the world may change a little. And for example, councils may introduce certain limits, or they might introduce action plans to protect threatened species. And if they do that, then those new policies will need to be ultimately reflected in a second generation of plans. We thought about whether or not we should stop and not introduce freshwater farm plans before councils have introduced their new regional plans, but we felt that that would create too much uncertainty and it would create a hiatus for too long. We are consulting on whether or not we've made the right choice there, by the way, but we think this is the right way to go, recognising that we'll have first generation and then second generation plans over time. Right, let's get into what they need to have in them. The purpose of the plan is to better control the adverse effects of farming on freshwater and freshwater ecosystems. And you see there that the minister is able to turn on the regulations in different parts or regions of New Zealand by phasing in the rollout. We are consulting on the key elements of the regulations now, but we're not consulting what's already been established in the Resource Management Act. Now, the Resource Management Act was amended last year, and Part 9A of the Resource Management Act was introduced. It's not a very long section. It's only about, from memory, it's about 12 or 15 sections. And it's well worth a read because it lays out, if you get the time, it lays out what the legal requirements are. And it's a useful thing to ground yourself with if you do have the time to have a look at it. So What will be in a freshwater farm plan? Well, one of the key things is the government is able to regulate outcomes that every single freshwater farm plan must demonstrate it's going to achieve. At the moment, we're proposing 3 outcomes. Those outcomes are around farm practices that minimize the effect of farming practices on the environment. We're talking about ecosystem health needs to be an outcome, and we're talking about the farm plan needs to reflect the wider catchment context. So what do we mean by that? Catchment context is about saying not all catchments are the same, and not all issues are the same in each catchment, and not all values that communities have for catchments are the same. For example, I could be in a catchment where there is a very sensitive receiving environment. It could be the Kaipara Harbour, or it might be a catchment in Southland, for example, that is of world significance. And that catchment might be filling up with sediment, for example. In that context, sediment is probably a more important priority to address than maybe nitrogen or E. coli, or biological contamination. That context of what are the priorities in the catchment need to be reflected in the farm plan, and we need a mechanism to do that. We're consulting on what that mechanism is. There'll also be key values that people have. For example, there might be a really important hangakai site. There might be other Māori values that they have for particular waterways. Where those values exist, they should be reflected into what is the priority actions that need to happen on farm in order to secure those values. Now, we're not suggesting that farmers need to go and talk to tangata whenua or mana whenua individually, but we are saying there needs to be a process so those sorts of values can be identified for farmers, and then so the farm plans can be reflective of those. Another key thing that every single farm plan needs to have is a risk and impact assessment. So evaluating what are the activities on the farm, and what are the inherent risks that are related to, for example, the landscape. It might be it's a highly erodible land. It might be that the soils are highly permeable, for example. So there'll be some inherent risks, and there'll be some management type risks. All of those need to be assessed and evaluated so that a series of mitigations can be identified, or measures can be identified that address those risks. All right. And really, that's at the very heart of what the freshwater farm planning regime is about. Bespoke solutions for bespoke risk and impact assessment. We've got some big questions to answer still about exactly how that process works. So who identifies the actions? Do you have a list of potential actions that relate to certain types of risks like sediment, or do you leave it entirely to the discretion of a farmer working with a farm advisor and then a farm certifier? So there are some big questions in there. We think probably the best way of doing it is to rely quite heavily on the skill and discretion of the freshwater certifier working with the farmer and maybe the farmer's advisor if they choose to use an advisor. And we'd put guidance and support around that. And there's already lots and lots of guidance and support that the sector groups have published. There's guidance around nutrient management. There's guidance around intensive winter grazing. There's numerous material that we can call on there. And it could also be that there are some quite specific or high risk matters where we end up being quite directive potentially. I don't mean directive as in saying all setbacks must be 4 meters or 3 meters. I mean directive as in saying this is a practice standard or a piece of guidance that everybody needs to use. And that could be, for example, intensive winter grazing, where we're already developed a module that farmers are voluntarily using throughout the country. It could be that such a piece of guidance becomes sort of specified in regulation that everybody needs to use that particular piece of guidance. We don't think that's applicable to use everywhere, but certainly things like intensive winter grazing and potentially stock exclusion outside of the areas that are currently regulated, that might be an area where we have quite specific practice standards that everybody needs to apply. There's another key question in here as well, and that is, having identified the actions, how do you prioritize those actions? What do you do first? What do you do second? And what's a reasonable time frame for a farmer to implement these actions? We're suggesting that that would largely be left to the discretion of the certifier working with the farmer, but with guidance that it needs to be reasonable. It needs to be reasonable, and it needs to be achievable, and it needs to be practical for each farmer's individual circumstances. Okay, there's a few more other bits and pieces that will need to be in the farm plan. There's some base information. You can imagine what this is. Where's the property? What sort of activities are happening? Some maps and farm information, and then who's the certifier and auditor that you've chosen. Over time, we are very keen that freshwater farm plans become digital, not paper-based. And one of the key reasons for that is so that we can potentially look to ways to use this inputted data in many, many different opportunities. So, for example, can we take the data that's been put in place for a freshwater farm plan and use it for greenhouse gas calculations and biodiversity potentially, and a range of other things that farmers at the moment are having to put multiple data in. Now, that's not an easy thing to achieve, but it's a really valuable goal if we can achieve it. So we will be working to try and achieve that. Another key question that's been raised is, what about the privacy of data? And look, we understand that there is a lot of sensitivity around the privacy of data, and we get that, and we are putting up proposals to protect the privacy, and commercial privacy as well of data. That needs to be balanced, though, with transparency and having a system that people trust in, because ultimately, remember, the goal here is to try and move to bespoke solutions rather than hard set rules, in council rules or in resource consents. But we do understand the privacy issue, and we are thinking about proposals that would agglomerate and anonymise information where that makes sense. So we are seeking people's views back on how to manage data and information. Every farm plan needs to be certified. I know I've already mentioned this, and I probably should have had this slide earlier on, but farm plans need to be certified, and those certifiers need to be competent and capable, and they also have to meet professional standards and be trusted by farmers and by the wider community to make sure that they're doing a good job. The way we are looking at doing that is by having firstly a national-based system to accredit certifies that they have a base set of competencies or a core set of competencies, and you can't be accredited as a certifier unless you meet those core competencies. The next thing is, each certifier needs to be able to operate in a region and needs to be able to make sure that the farm plan reflects regional rules. You remember I've talked about that before, and that means that the way the law is written is so that ultimately who gets to operate in a given region has to be appointed by the regional council. So there'll be a system as well, a two-tier system. You get your national accreditation to recognise that you've got the competencies of a farm planner, and then a test by the regional council to make sure you know what's going on in that region, you know what the regional rules are. All right. We're expecting that national body will also undertake things like quality assurance, and manage things like disputes. There'll have to be a dispute resolution. There has to be a process by which, if a farmer feels like they're getting an unfair shake, then they have a readily accessible and inexpensive way of going and challenging that. We're expecting that farm plans will be certified or recertified about every 3 years. There's an option in there for 5 years, so we're interested in people's feedback on that particular issue. If there's a major change in the farm system, then the farm plan would need to be redone and recertified. Other than that, we're expecting just adjustments be made as the farm plan is recertified, or perhaps new rules are written or something like that. I'm just going to stop and check with the team here for a second. We've got lots of chat. I just want to make sure that this is not going too fast, not too high level, not too detailed, but it's sort of delivering on what people are hoping to get out of this system. So I'll carry on, and I'll expect to see a chat or somebody let me know if this ain't quite hitting the mark. All right. So I'll carry on with the design of the audit system. Instead of having a sort of national body to appoint or accredit auditors, there are already lots of bodies in place, and there are already a lot of auditors in place who are already working with farmers. So we expect to just leverage off those existing processes. They still need to be appointed by the regional council, but we're not expecting the same level of accreditation or national system for auditors, as I say, because there are those processes already in place. The farmers will engage and pay the auditor. So there was some suggestion maybe somebody else should engage the auditor, but in fact, farmer engaging or the client engaging auditors is a very commonly used mechanism, including in places like food security and elsewhere. So that's the proposal. We're proposing that the first audit would happen after 18 months, and then the future audits would be based on a risk assessment, if you like. If you've passed your audit and passed it well, then the audit process could extend to 3 years. If you fail your audit or you need significant corrections, then 12 months is the proposal. So to sum all of that up in one place, the farm plan, from our perspective, it provides a record of the environmental actions that past and present that each farmer is undertaking. It can support the development of an integrated plan because it can kind of provide the cornerstone information, maps and base information that can then be used in other places. It links the farm to the community or catchment group priorities and aspirations, right? So it allows the priorities to be coordinated across many farms without having to write specific rules around that. It helps inform future regional plans. And by that we mean, we know that through actions through farm plans, if enough farmers take them and they're coordinated, we can achieve many of the objectives that we're looking for in things like the national policy statement, just using these farm plans. Now that won't be the case everywhere. There are places where, for example, we have very, very high nitrogen discharges. Farm plans are probably not the place to address some of those issues where we've got, a really high level of over allocation, for example, or too many discharges. But in many cases, we can make really substantial environmental gains without having to write specific rules. And then the gains you expect to gain through the farm planning process can be reflected back in the regional plans. There's also the opportunity to provide assurance to suppliers and to customers about the environmental integrity of New Zealand's products. And that's one of the reasons why we're really keen to engage with the processors and with industry assurance programs and make sure that they are at the core of delivering some of these freshwater farm plan systems, so that they can make the link back to customers and to suppliers. As I said before, it potentially provides an alternative route to hard and fast rules and to resource consents, and it provides the farmers with the opportunity to bring all their requirements together in one place in a way that makes sense to them on their farm. So the freshwater farm plan itself, it needs to reflect catchment context. We've talked about that. What's important in the catchment? What are the values in the catchment? It needs to have a risk and impact assessment, and it needs to identify actions that are specific to address those identified risks and impacts. Then on the outside, the right-hand column on your screen here, then it also needs to reflect whatever specific rules are identified through the new freshwater farm plan, through the regional councils plans, and whatever regulatory rules there are through, for example, the stock exclusion regulations. Okay. So the rollout. We appreciate this won't be possible everywhere all at the same time, and the legislation allows for a phased rollout, which is what we're proposing. It will take time to have every farm with a certified freshwater farm plan, and timing will largely depend on the resources and capacity of auditors, certifiers in particular, advisors, and regional councils to roll out the system. We're proposing to roll it out catchment by catchment, but exactly how we do that, we're looking for feedback on. There's two ways that we could think about this. One is we could roll out in areas where, for example, we know we've got really significant issues, for example, with high nitrogen loads going into our water bodies. Or we could roll it out in places where we know that the freshwater farm planning regime and good practices under the freshwater farm planning regime are likely to lead to long-term solutions. And the answer to that question is a little tricky. If we went with the first option, then it's quite possible that once councils implement their new regional plans, significant changes would need to be made to the freshwater farm plan. If we go for the second option, probably only minor changes will need to be made to the freshwater farm plan in future, because we already know that the things a farmer can do on their land are going to achieve the long-term big outcomes that we're looking for. So those are the kind of issues we need to work through. We also, of course, need to make sure that there is the capacity in the advisory services and support services for farmers to back this up. And in that respect, we're really keen to make sure, for example, farmers have the opportunity to participate in catchment groups and to get farmer-to-farmer support to help implement these new requirements. Unfortunately, we do need to talk about enforcement. Essentially, councils can use any of their existing RMA enforcement mechanisms to enforce the requirements of a freshwater farm plan. Those requirements, by the way, are that farmers have one when they're required to, and that they implement the actions that are in one. So that's the two sort of key requirements. They have to have them certified in the timeframes required, and they have to have them audited in the timeframes required. And there are we're also proposing to introduce fees, infringement fees that are related to non-compliance with some or all of those requirements. If there is major non-compliance, though, we expect that councils will use their existing RMA enforcement mechanisms. We're also looking at how we can introduce a system so that if we have a major event, we have a Canterbury flood again, the farm plan can be, if you like, suspended or adapted quickly so it reflects the farmer's new circumstances. Okay, and this is my last slide on freshwater farm plans, which is public consultation goes till 12th September. We'll then do a summary of submissions, and that needs to be before the end of this year. We then need to provide some advice to ministers, and that is through to early 2022. It's likely there'll be ongoing discussions between officials and sort of key representatives, partners, tangata whenua, mana whenua, farming sector bodies and the like, NGOs potentially and the like throughout that process. We'll develop proposed regulations in the first half of 2022, and then from there on, we'll start to look at rolling out the new system. I'm going to take a wee pause there and let everybody shake off freshwater farm plans for just one moment, because the next thing I want to cover quickly is proposed changes to the low slope map for stock exclusion regulations. Okay, change mental gear shift. It's not an entire mental gear shift, by the way, because these two things are quite closely interrelated. The government made regulations that incorporated a low slope map for where stock exclusion was required. Stock exclusion will still be covered, by the way, in freshwater farm plans, but the regulations cover where it's absolutely mandatory, where it has to happen. It requires stock exclusion from wide rivers, natural wetlands, and lakes for areas that were identified in the low slope map. It mainly relates to beef cattle and deer, because pigs and dairy cattle, dairy support cattle have to be excluded from waterways under the regulations wherever they are. It's also important to note that if a farmer, even if you're not in the low slope map, but if you are intensively grazing, break feeding, or irrigating pasture, then you also need to stock exclude, even if you're not covered under the low slope map. The regulations don't cover sheep, and I think that's important to note, nor do they cover feral animals either. So what happened? Well, the current map was set based on an average slope of 10 degrees land, averaged across a land parcel. Unfortunately, that proved to have some significant flaws in it. First, it identified quite a lot of steep land. Because it was averaged over a land parcel, it picked up parts of each land parcel that had quite steep land. And we estimate somewhere around about 11.5% of the land in the map was actually over 10 degrees in average slope. And there were some pretty extreme examples in there where it would be very, very difficult, if not practically impossible, to do stock exclusion. I should say, by the way, stock exclusion does not refer to fencing. Stock exclusion refers to anything that effectively keeps stock out of waterways. So it might be an electric fence, or it might be other mechanisms that you use, including some emerging technologies that seem to be, out there on the edge of technology. Another problem was that it treated similar areas of land differently depending on the size of the land parcel. So we had these equity problems. And finally, it didn't give effect to Cabinet's expectation or decision that stock exclusions wouldn't cover extensive or low intensity farming systems in the high country, and that rather those sort of systems would be best managed through the freshwater farm planning system. So we had some problems. And what we're proposing is that we have recalculated the way the map works. It's now based on much more local terrain. So it doesn't take a whole land parcel and try and average land slope across that. We've changed the threshold. We're proposing changing the threshold from 5 degrees down to 10 degrees. Now, what that does is it makes it much, much, much less likely that steep land will be picked up in the new farm plan. The new low slope map. But, and this is important, the land that's between 5 degrees and 10 degrees will still be mapped somewhere, and there'll be an expectation under the freshwater farm planning system that stock would be required to be excluded in that land unless there's a really good reason not to. And we'll put criteria out about what those reasons are. And this kind of demonstrates the power of the freshwater farm planning system to be able to provide some scope, some discretion, to be able to adapt rules to individual farming circumstances. We've also proposing to remove land that is over 500 metres in altitude, and that will remove tall tussock and depleted grassland. And that responds to that issue about not wanting to capture extensive pastoral systems through the stock exclusion regulations, but rather those sorts of areas are better managed through the freshwater farm planning system. Okay, this just gives you an example in Central Otago of the effect of those changes. You can see the darker colour there is what was picked up under the old mapping system, and the lighter colour there is what is now picked up under the new system. You'll note, though, if you look really carefully, that there are some areas that have actually been added. And if you look, that's in the sort of middle right of your screen there. And that's because the new mapping system is actually more accurate, and it has picked up, whereas flatter land was being excluded before because it was mixed in with a hilly land parcel. Now some of that land is being picked up because it's more locally driven. Okay, I'm nearly at an end, and then we'll get stuck into some questions. I just wanted to update you quickly on intensive winter grazing. This has also been a significant issue. We've had advice from the Southland Intensive Winter Grazing Advisory Group, and they've identified a number of challenges, implementation issues, as is many people with the intensive winter grazing rules, and also some solutions. We are now working through those solutions, and we are reasonably close to providing advice to ministers, and then ministers coming out and agreeing that we can consult on what those solutions might be. So in the meantime, the government decided to defer the permitted activity rules. These were the rules that had the resow date in them and the pugging depth in them, which have proved to be particularly problematic for many farmers. So watch this space. We understand that farmers, well, everybody for that matter, tangata whenua and Māori farmers, councils are under a lot of pressure. There's a lot going on at the moment through consultation. We get that. So we'll try and bring these, as soon as we can, we'll try and bring these into a single process to make consultation as easy as possible. All right, so I thought I'd just give you a quick heads up on that. And with that, Pārtai, questions?
Hey, thank you very much for that, Brian. Look, we've got a hell of a lot of questions here. I don't know if we're going to get through them all, so I'll do my best to theme them. So we'll start off with the freshwater farm planning related questions. There's a good question here, Brian. Is 70% of hill country farmers within the Tararua already have these farm plans in place? Why are MFE not encouraging by investing so the other 30% get these plans in place sooner?
That's a really good question. Firstly, MFE is investing, or the government really is investing in the Horizons area. Horizons got a number of proposals through Jobs for Nature, and they include actions on farm. I think that the SLUI program, by the way, is roughly a third funded at the moment. So this is a sustainable land use program. It's about a third of money comes through from the central government, a third from the regional council, and a third from landowners. So we have been investing in those areas, but it raises a really interesting point. And if 70% of farmers in that district are engaged and 30% aren't, I don't know why that 30% aren't, and I'm not going to speculate on why they aren't. But we do know that there is a group of people who sort of never want to engage in these things. And I think that's one of the key reasons why we're moving to a mandatory regime. And I talked about a whole range of benefits from the mandatory regime, but it's not fair that a group of people aren't towing the line, and effectively that reflects badly on everybody at times. So we know there's a hell of a lot of great work being done, and there are people who are sort of letting that down. So that is one of the reasons why we're looking at a mandatory approach.
Thanks, Brian. Another question here. Where are the certifiers going to come from? Example, council staff or private?
That's a really good question. We are neutral as to whether they would be private or council staff. My expectation is that they'll be largely private. We are looking right now, in fact, before this meeting, we had a session that's looking at how we can use the available resources through, for example, Jobs for Nature, to build up the capacity and capability in some of these really key areas, not just certifiers, but in people who can work with farmers who know, what are the requirements and help them through these processes. And also, how do we establish more catchment groups, for example, who can support farmer to farmer learning and engagement. So yes, we're aware that there are some real gaps in the system, and we are looking at a plan backed up with resources in order to address those issues.
And just team, I'm picking questions randomly because there's so many. Another question here. Can you clarify how the outcomes are described? Will it be about the farm practice or the outcome? For example, no mud from winter grazing versus no mud or runoff entering waterways.
The outcomes will focus on the environmental outcomes rather than the practice outcomes. But the actions that then demonstrate you're delivering on those environmental outcomes will be specific to activities. Now, the actions could be things like management practices, they might be staff training, or they might be things like fencing or changing practices to do with irrigation, for example. So the actions can be very open, but they will be related to practices. The outcomes will be related to the environmental outcomes.
Kia ora, Brian. Hey, are we ensuring that individual farmers aren't going to have to jump through another hoop if already getting assessed by their supplier group or regional council?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think I sort of answered that on the way through. Ultimately, I think systems that are already in place, we want to leverage off what is already in place. But there are specific requirements under the RMA and under the new law. So I think what will happen over time is those existing systems will be adapted, and we certainly want to work with the providers of those existing systems, the NZ GAPs and the Tiakis and the Lead with Prides and the Beef and Lambs planning system, etc. We want to work with them so that we can have a sensible transition. We certainly don't want to have multiple planning systems out there that each farmer has to do that are essentially doing very similar things. And we do appreciate, by the way, that there are different standards, for example, that might come through from, say, European requirements or European supermarket requirements or European government requirements that need to be reflected, which is, again, the power of bringing the industry bodies into the system and be able to deliver what we need out of the RMA process, but in the context of what farmers need to do for their customers.
Thanks, Brian. I think we'll go for about 3 more farm planning related questions, then we'll get into the other part. So I'd like to know more how freshwater farm plans and catchment action plans will work together.
Oh, that's a great question. I talked about catchment context, and catchment context can be built up by a range of ways. We'd expect that councils would lead a process to bring together information in one place about what's going on in the catchment and what's important in the catchment. But it shouldn't be a process that's solely driven by regional councils, and doesn't have to be a process that's solely driven by regional councils. Obviously, mana whenua will have a significant input into what are the values, what are the key sites, that need to be reflected and protected through the farm planning regime or system. But also, if there are ground up sort of catchment based plans, there's no reason in the world why they couldn't form part of that catchment context.
Thanks, Brian. I think we'll go for a couple more farm plan related questions. There's a couple of catchment context questions I think you've already answered. Hey, how will we ensure that freshwater farm plan auditors are impartial and not pushing an agenda for their industry?
Yeah, that's another good question. There's a few parts to that. I guess, firstly, the auditors, I think, are less likely to, there's less risk of capture, if you like. The audit processes are very common across a whole raft of industries now, and there are bodies that oversee the performance of auditors. They have professional standards that they sign up to, for example. So I'm not worried with certifiers or auditors, but I think there is we need to build some of those internal quality assurance and performance assurance systems more in the certification area probably than we do in the audit area, because, as I say, there are already a lot of processes in place around the performance, integrity, etc. of auditors. So when it comes to certifiers and the quality of certified plans, I think that's the ultimate issue here. There will need to be in place a quality assurance process, and that process we would expect will include things like random selection of plans. And if if things come to light, then there needs to be processes to address those. For example, if there are systemic concerns that one certifier or one auditor, if you like, it could be, isn't following or meeting the requirements, then those sorts of things need to be picked up through the professional performance standards and addressed there.
Cheers, Brian. Here's a really good question. NZ Arm is currently working on identification of capability gaps and delivering training, trying to address some of these gaps. And we're having a challenge with how to do that. Do we think that delivering a freshwater farm plan would, one, be a multidisciplinary approach with lots of expertise having input to develop more comprehensive and robust plans, or two, are we after super farm planners that understand the multitude of components on farm and how to manage fresh water?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And I'll start out with a comment, which is, it's ironic that we almost expect farmers to be able to do all of these things and understand all these rules and understand all these requirements, be they coming from the government or the marketplace, from the regional council or from a community, while still running a farm and still running a profitable farm, and still, excellence in animal husbandry and profitable and all those sorts of things. Yes, the answer is a farm certifier should be able to depend on a raft of professional skills if they're in areas that they don't, where they're not competent in, or it's a particularly specialist area. I mean, it might be things like effluent management, or it might be, irrigation systems. Ideally, we don't want farmers to have to engage too many people because that adds cost. But as the complexity of the operation goes up, it may well be that the certifier or the farm advisor needs to bring in specialist skills.
Thank you, Brian. This is another question here. Data collected to date on the farm environment plans in Canterbury is demonstrating that nitrate levels are still increasing and water quality within surface and groundwater is continuing to decline, with previously pristine lakes now in serious trouble. If the new freshwater farm plans are modelled on the Canterbury FEPs, how does MFE and MPI propose to prevent the same situation from happening for the rest of the country?
Yeah, okay. I'm not going to comment on the data because I'm not aware of that data. I'm not disputing it either, but I'm just not aware of it. So I won't comment on that specific issue. But what it does raise is a really important point, which is we don't expect that where you've got major challenges like, for example, very high nitrate leaching in an area, that freshwater farm plans on their own are the tool to address those. We can't imagine a situation where, say, a farm plan certifier could say to somebody, look, you have to cut your nitrogen discharges by 80% because that's what's happening in the catchment. That's a conversation that has to happen between regional councils, communities, tangata whenua and the farming community to set down a transitional pathway, if you like, to set where long-term where you need to get to. And obviously the NPS has got bottom lines that have to be achieved. So long-term where you need to get to, how long that pathway is and what that transition looks like. That is a conversation that happens through the National Policy Statement implementation process that councils need to complete by December 2024. How freshwater farm plans fit with that is once those decisions are made, and if those decisions have specific rules or caps or limits or whatever it might be, those rules then need to be reflected back into the freshwater farm plan. So what I'm really trying to say is that there is a role for freshwater farm plans, and it's a support tool, and it can achieve certain environmental outcomes. But where we've got really significant issues, those need to be addressed through the main planning process and through a conversation between communities, councils, mana whenua, tangata whenua, and farmers, of course.
Thanks, Brian. Hey, look, I think we'll go for 2 more questions. It's 28 minutes past 2. We've been in here looking at a screen for an hour. Will submissions take account of the submissions made last year, as many farmers are disengaging as believe regulators are not listening? How do we encourage re-engagement?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm not sure what the legal position of that is actually, whether or not they can. Certainly the idea of the freshwater farm planning system responded to some of those really high level key themes that we heard through the essential freshwater and consultation. And that was that, hard and fast rules just are very difficult and they don't really work. And that they're looking for more bespoke solutions that fit with the farming, the individual farming circumstances. How do we get farmers to re-engage? That is a really good question. And I'm not sure I'm the right person with a great answer. Certainly we'll be trying to work through sector groups and those sorts of things. We'll also be looking at trying to get, maybe smaller groups together so that we can get a span of views that are kind of representative without necessarily having to get sort of get every farmer having to have input. So we'll do our best to do that. Yeah, it's about all I can say on that one.
Thanks, Brian. Hey, look, team, it's 2:30. We'll go for one more question, and just rest assured, the rest of the questions that we've got in the Q&A box, we will be answering them with detailed answers and firing that through to everyone today. And again, it's all being recorded as well. How's that sound to you, Brian?
Sounds good to me.
Okay. Hey, well, last question. What support will be in place to train new certifiers, subsidise or free training, student allowances for those who are working in the other sectors and therefore need to give up work to retrain?
Yeah, another terrific question. So we're working on a plan for that. I think it's fair to say, and we do have some resource available, and exactly how that works, we need to work through part of the implementation work for this. We know we need to get onto it too because we know time is short. It's interesting though, because most of people's learning, of course, happens on the job, and not that much really happens through institutional training. That's not to say institutional training isn't important, it is, but we also need to think about how we can get some of the experienced people who have years of experience and terrific skills to be able to read a landscape and engage with farmers in ways that sort of make sense, as well as being able to think through the business as a whole and make sure the business is profitable. How do we get new people to get alongside those people? So we'll be thinking about plans that aren't just about tertiary and formal training, but also about mentoring and making it easier for organizations to employ people, bring them on and give them the opportunity to get alongside experience. The last thing we want is people who have good intentions but not enough experience to really be able to communicate with farmers in ways that make sense to the farmers about their business and their land.
Thank you, Brian. Hey, look, we'll go for a couple more questions, because while you're here. Hey, Brian, what are some of the thinking relating to how the certification process will attain tangata whenua expectations within that space? In addition, where do you see mana whenua fitting into the freshwater farm plan certification and auditing process?
Yeah, great question. A few things. There's a few things wrapped up in there. One, we'd be very keen to see a significant proportion of advisors, certifiers, auditors who are Māori, who identify as tangata whenua. And there's a number of reasons for that. But one is because there's big capability issues across Māori tangata whenua as well, and just engaging with all of this, and there are new processes and requirements for councils to engage. And if we have a pool of expertise, that pool is available for a range of things. We also think it's valuable, really valuable, to connect farmers with tangata whenua in ways that are relationship based, not forced by central government or something like that. So that's one answer to that question. But we do see a role for tangata whenua across the freshwater management system. As I noted before, we don't see a specific obligation on farmers to go and identify who are mana whenua and talk to them directly. That would be unfair on both mana whenua and on farmers, and it would create far too much load on everybody. But we do see, for example, tangata whenua firstly having a significant role in the development of national policy or regional policy plans. And remember, those plans need to be reflected back into the freshwater farm plans eventually. We also see tangata whenua having a substantial role in the developing information about catchment context. What are the important sites? What are the important values? And then there's also potential for and we expect that there will be representation in various stages of the system overall. So, for example, who sets the competencies for what a freshwater certifier needs to have? Those competencies should be developed with input from tangata whenua, and assessing whether or not the system overall is working and delivering outcomes. We would expect that there would be Māori representation as part of that oversight process as well. And that kind of reflects the interest Māori have, the very, very substantial connections Māori have with water.
Hey, thanks, Brian. Look, just looking at the numbers, I see we're already starting to get people dropping off. That's our cue to start wrapping up, I think. Again, just a reminder, we will be sending out a detailed question and answer fact sheet to you all. Thank you very, very much for attending today. Before I close up, I'd just like to throw it back to Sophia and to Brian to say any final words. Again, from me, thanks, team. I've got to go and pick up my naughty son at 3 o'clock. Brian.
Now, you've heard more than enough from me. Thank you all again so much for your participation and your questions. It's hugely appreciated.
Hey, Sophia, any final?
Kia ora. Yeah, nothing further from me. Thank you. Thanks, Winnie, for facilitating that, and Brian for kind of getting on and answering all of those questions. As Winnie said, huge amount of really interesting comments and feedback that came in. So we'll send out that information. We'll post links as well to where you can find some of the content in the discussion documents will capture a lot of the questions that have come through. So we'll make sure you have those as well.
Thanks.
Great.
Brian, can you flick to the final slide? So lastly, submissions, there's the website. It's all on the website. One of our team will put it in the chat. We'll fire through a detailed Q&A fact sheet with the presentation, with the links. Please throw it at us, team. We're here to make the water better. We're here to keep people happy. Well, we're here to do our job. So again, thank you very much. We'll wrap it up there. Kia ora, everybody.